Clown Mask. Excerpt. The Clown Mask is a creepy short story about a group of boys who are cleaning an old warehouse when they come across something strange hidden in an old wooden box. 3 teenage boys were looking for a summer job. They were hired by a company and given the task of cleaning out an old warehouse. While they were working, one of the boys found an old, red wooden box among the piles of rubbish. The teenagers gathered around the box, curious to see what was inside. When they opened it, they were disappointed. All they found inside the box was a clown mask. It was a grotesque mask with narrow, beady eyes, a bulbous red nose and a large, crooked mouth. One of the boys picked up the mask and put it on. He immediately began to laugh and jump up and down. The other 2 boys chuckled at the display and clapped their hands. They watched as he danced around the warehouse, flailing his arms around like a crazy person. His laughter echoed around the old, stone walls of the warehouse. He danced faster and faster and finally the 2 boys didn't find it so funny anymore. The masked boy was jerking and twisting his body into absurd shapes. His friends began to get worried that there was something wrong with him. He kept falling over and banging his head against the ground, whereupon he would immediately spring to his feet and resume the crazy dance. The boy was clawing at the mask and laughing like a madman. It looked like he was having some kind of seizure. His friends ran after him and when they grabbed him, he fell to the floor and stopped moving. They ripped off the mask and when they saw his face, they were horrified. The boy's face was twisted in an expression of terrible pain. Blood was flowing from his eyes, nose and mouth. They immediately called an ambulance, but by the time it arrived, it was too late. The boy had died from his injuries. 3 Wishes. Excerpt. 3 Wishes is a spooky little story about an old man who encounters an old hag that grants him 3 wishes. An elderly man was sitting alone on a dark path. He wasn't sure of which direction to go, and he'd forgotten both where he was traveling to. He also couldn't remember who he was. He sat down for a moment to rest his weary legs, and suddenly looked up to see an elderly woman before him. Her skin was wrinkled and gray and her nose was crooked. Warts covered her hairy chin. She grinned toothlessly and said with a cackle, "Now your 3rd wish." "What will it be?" "3rd wish." The man was baffled. "How can it be 3 wishes if I haven't had a 1st and 2nd wish?" "You've had 2 wishes already," the old hag said, "but your 2nd wish was for me to return everything to the way it was before you had made your 1st wish. That's why you remember nothing, because everything is the way it was before you made any wishes." She cackled at the poor man. "So it is that you have 1 wish left." "All right," he said hesitantly, "I don't believe this, but there's no harm in trying. I wish to know who I am." "Funny," said the old woman as she granted his wish and disappeared forever. "That was your 1st wish." Radio Show. Excerpt. The Radio Show is a scary true story about a woman who called into a radio program that was broadcast in Mexico and begged for help, claiming that her son was possessed and was trying to kill her. The transcripts of the radio show have been translated from Spanish. There is a radio show in Mexico called La Mano Peluda, The Hairy Hand. It has been on the air for over 20 years and it used to broadcast after midnight. Every night, real people call into the show and share scary stories that have happened to them or supernatural events that they have experienced. I used to listen to the show every night, after I went to bed. My parents didn't like me listening to it, but I turned the radio down low so they couldn't hear. A few years ago, I heard one story that chilled me to the bone. A lady called in and said her son was trying to kill her. Here is a transcript of the recording. Caller: "Señor Carlos, help me. Please, help me. My son wants to kill me." Host: "Let's see, calm down señora. Tell me what happened." Caller: "For 7 months now, my son has been playing the Ouija board at night. I did not take it seriously, but now he speaks in another language and says strange words. He says that he wants to kill me and his brothers. He is very strong, much stronger than any normal 13-year-old boy. He tried to kill the dog with a knife and today, number. Please don't. No." Host: "Señora, what happened? Tell me, señora, are you still on the line?" Caller: help me, please. My son is levitating in his bed. My God, he is floating. He is floating. Help me, please. His eyes are all white and he has a knife. Madre de Dios. What do you want? Leave my son alone. Oh God. Señor Carlos. Someone help me. At this point in the recording, screaming and crying are heard in the background and all of a sudden, the call is cut off. For the next 3 days, the host of the radio show kept playing the recording over and over, asking for the lady to call in again. He also asked the public to identify her so they could try and get her some help. Eventually, a young man called into the show and said he had some information. This is a transcript of the recording. Caller: I have information about the lady you are looking for, Senor Carlos, but it is better that you stop playing with what you don't understand. Look no more into it. He is strong, he can kill you. Just walk away. Announcer: what are you talking about? What is your name? Tell me. Young: I am just telling you to be careful. I told you to leave it alone, you idiot. Please don't do anything. Just listen carefully to the recording. Listen, listen, listen. At that point, the call was cut off. The next day, the host of the radio show had some specialists on and they analyzed the first recording of the lady who called in. Using various techniques, they were able to isolate and enhance the screams and cries at the end of the recording. At first, it sounded like there were several people screaming and crying at once, but when they played one of the isolated voices, I swear to you, it chilled me to the bone. The voice was just an echo, but it said, "I'll kill you *H. I'll kill everyone, and if you're still asking for help, I'll kill them too. Nobody will help you, help you, help you, help you." It was horrible, because the echo was very distant but very clear. Weeks later, another man called into the radio show. He was very frightened, but he said he was willing to tell the host what had happened during the recording. Look, Senor Carlos, I will tell you about the day that lady called in. Her name is Senora Julia and she is the caretaker of a building in an area south of the city of Mexico. Late one night, I and 10 other residents in the building heard anguished cries. They were coming from the home of Senora Julia. We all rushed out onto our balconies which faced toward the courtyard where her home is. We heard her screaming and several men, including myself, went down to her house to find out what was happening. We forced the door open and saw her with the telephone to her ear, asking someone for help. That someone, we later learned, was you. Just then, we heard screaming and crying throughout the building. It was so strong that it stunned us for a moment. Senora Julia hung up the phone and ran to us, pleading with us for help. When we asked why, she said there was something wrong with her boy. Seriously, Senor, I have never seen anything like it before or since. We were all petrified with fear. We saw her eldest son and, I don't know if you can believe this, but he was floating. He was about 3 feet off the floor. His eyes were blank and he had an evil smile on his face. I do not know how to describe it. He was smiling from ear to ear and it was a diabolical smile. In his hand, he was holding a large knife and it was dripping with blood. The neighbors didn't know what to do. We asked the lady what was happening and she just said that he wanted to kill everyone. We ran out of the house into the courtyard, but the boy followed us. He was in the middle of the courtyard, floating in the air and babbling in a strange language. All of the neighbors saw it. Some began to shout and others began to pray. One man tried to stop the boy by pulling on his foot. We helped him wrestle the boy to the ground. He was passed out and his eyes were rolling back in his head, but he would not let go of the knife. We did the only thing we could think of, Senor. We called a priest. At that point, the recording cut off. The host of the radio show said he had tried to communicate with the lady and the man, but because neither of them had given their names, all of his attempts were unsuccessful. They spent months analyzing the previous recordings, but specialists said only that the young man must be possessed by a strong demonic spirit and without more information, there was nothing they could do. According to the host, the radio show had to change its schedule because of the call. Afterwards, staff claimed they heard whispering voices, cries and moans in the building after midnight. On more than one occasion, a member of the radio show's staff was thrown against a wall or beaten savagely by someone or something that was not physically there. One audio technician was seriously injured in a car accident, which he said was caused when the ghostly face of a young boy appeared on the windscreen as he was driving. The staff of the radio show were so afraid that they complained to the producers and threatened to quit. The producers were forced to reschedule the show so that it started at 10 p.m. and finished just before midnight. McDonald's. Excerpt. McDonald's is a disturbing story about one man's obsession with the famous fast food restaurant. When his family get tired of eating at McDonald's, the father is offended and takes matters into his own hands. My dad was obsessed with McDonald's. He couldn't live without it. He wouldn't eat at just any fast food restaurant. No Burger King, no Wendy's, it had to be McDonald's. It got to the point where he would have to eat something from McDonald's at least once a day. Sometimes, for breakfast, he would run out and get a sausage and egg McMuffin. For lunch, he would grab a McChicken sandwich or a bacon double cheeseburger. His favorite meal was a Big Mac and fries. He enjoyed the food, but the rest of the family quickly got tired of it. After a while, my mother, my sister and myself couldn't put up with it anymore. We couldn't bear to look at another chicken McNugget. Gradually, we started trying to avoid eating at McDonald's with him. When he realized what we were doing, it really irritated him. He acted like we had somehow betrayed him by not liking McDonald's. "What's wrong?" he demanded one day. "Why won't you come to McDonald's? Is it because you don't want to eat with me?" My mom looked at the floor and my sister pretended she hadn't heard him. "It's not that, Dad," I explained awkwardly. "It's just that we don't want to eat at McDonald's anymore." He stared at us for a few moments, then shook his head sadly and left. 20 minutes later, he came back with a double quarter pounder with cheese and ate it alone in the living room. He spent the rest of the evening sulking and giving us dirty looks. One night, after I finished my homework and watched a little TV, I decided to go to bed. My little sister was already fast asleep on the top of the bunk bed. I turned off the light in the bedroom and quietly slid into the bottom bunk, taking care not to wake her. Sometime later, I heard our bedroom door creak open. Squinting in the light from the hallway, I could see a figure standing in the doorway. I blinked my eyes in surprise. It was Ronald McDonald. He was just standing there, silently staring at us. He didn't seem to be aware that I was awake. In the dim light, he crept into the room and tiptoed quietly over to our bunk bed. From where I was lying, on the bottom bunk, I could see him reach out and start to shake my sister. "I'm lovin' it," he showed. "Ha ha ha, I'm lovin' it, I'm lovin' it, ha ha ha." I heard my sister's piercing scream as the bed began shaking violently. All of a sudden, something fell off the top bunk and hit the desk below, knocking it over and scattering pens and notebooks all over the floor. From the doorway, I heard my mother's voice cry out in alarm, "What the hell are you doing?" Ronald McDonald rushed over and turned on the light. At that moment, I realized that it was just my dad dressed up in a Ronald McDonald costume. I rubbed my eyes and looked around. Underneath the overturned desk, I saw part of my sister's pink pajamas peeping out. There was a pool of blood forming around it. My mother began screaming hysterically and my father just stood there in shock. The ambulance came a few minutes later and the paramedics rushed in. They looked at my dad in astonishment and my dad, in his excitement, punched one of them in the face. It was absolute chaos. My mom kept shouting, "No, no, you stay at home." But my dad pushed her out of the way and scrambled into the back of the ambulance with my sister. Our neighbors were all standing in their gardens in their pajamas, watching us, dumbfounded. There wasn't much they could do for my sister in the hospital. She had injured her spine and her brain in her fall. When the doctors eventually let her come home, she just lay on the bed, her eyes open wide, her teeth clench and unclenching and her arms and legs waving uncontrollably. Before the accident, my sister had been so sweet and pretty, but now she was completely changed. She couldn't speak. All she could do was groan, "NNNNMPH, NNNNMMMM, NNNHMMMMN, dog G." When my mom asked my dad why he did it, he told her it was to make us like McDonald's more. My mom cried. I said nothing. My dad just kept munching on his Big Mac. Cheap divorce. Excerpt. A cheap divorce is a creepy crime story with a twist in the tale. It's about a man who hates his wife and plans to murder her while they are on holiday together. I loved my wife. You've got to believe me. At least, I did love her when we first got married. As time went on, we grew apart. Love slowly turned to hate and affection turned to resentment. Every little thing she did began to annoy me and I grew to detest every minute I was forced to spend with her. Till death us do part. That's what we promised when we read our wedding vows. Little did I know how ironic those wedding vows would turn out to be. Hate is a terrible thing. When there's hate in your heart, it festers and grows like a cancer. Before you know it, the hate has taken over your mind. It clouds your better judgment. It poisons your thoughts and makes you do things you never thought possible. I hated my wife and this hatred preyed on my mind. It followed me around like a bad smell and tormented me day after day, until I was obsessed with it. Eventually, I got to the point of no return. The point where I was plotting to kill my wife. I wanted to be rid of her and all I could think of were ways to murder her without getting caught. I came up with an ingenious plan, a plan so cunning, I was sure nothing could go wrong. I told my wife I was taking her on holiday. I pretended that the purpose of the trip was so we could work on our marriage and try to repair what had been irreparably broken. The place I chose for our vacation was a remote hotel, high up in the mountains. From the balcony of our hotel room, there was a wonderful, panoramic view of the snow-capped mountains that surrounded us. There was also a hiking trail that led all around the mountain and skirted the cliffs. At one point on the trail, there was a spot where the cliff edge was crumbling away. If someone wasn't careful, they could lose their footing and plunge to their death. It was perfect. One glance over the edge was enough to make you dizzy. There was a sheer drop of almost 1,000 feet, and at the bottom, there were nothing but jagged rocks that would tear your body to pieces. The next morning, after breakfast, I invited my wife to go for a walk with me along the mountain trail. We left the hotel together and hiked up the path, neither of us saying a word. When we reached the spot where the cliff was crumbling away, my wife suddenly stopped in her tracks. She looked over the edge and shuddered. This was my chance to push her off. There was nobody around. We were completely alone. I took a few steps closer to her. My hands were shaking. Then, she turned to face me. There was an odd look in her eyes. "Do you have even the tiniest bit of love left in your heart for me?" she asked. There was no reason to lie anymore. "No," I replied. "I thought so," she said. "I just wanted to give you one last chance." "One last chance?" I said. "What do you mean?" "Before we left the hotel, I wrote a note and gave it to the hotel manager," she said. "I told him that if anything happened to me, he should give it to the police. In the note, I told them I know you are planning to kill me. I told them you're planning to push me off a cliff. I know you hate me, but you have no idea how much I hate you. Try as you might, you'll never be able to convince anyone that this was an accident." I was confused. That what was an accident? I asked dumbly. Before I had a chance to react, she threw herself over the edge of the cliff. I couldn't get to her in time. I could only watch in horror as she fell, shrieking and whirling, plummeting to her death on the jagged rocks below. She hated me so much that she killed herself, just to frame me for a murder I didn't commit. I tried to tell the police that it was an accident, but they didn't believe me. They arrested me and clapped me in handcuffs. During my trial, I testified, telling the jury exactly what happened, but they ignored my street story. The note my wife had written was all the evidence they needed. They found me guilty of the murder in the first degree and the judge sentenced me to death. That's how I came to be sitting on death row. As I languish in this cell, waiting for my inevitable execution, I have a lot of time to think. I can't stop myself thinking. I have a lot of regrets, but there's one in particular that torments me. I can't help thinking that getting a divorce would have been so much easier. Short tales. Excerpt. Very scary short tales for kids and adults to read online. These quick samples of horror should be taken just before bedtime to ensure pleasant nightmares. 1. My daughter cries and screams at night. Every time I visit her grave, I ask her to stop, but she won't listen. 2. Lying in bed, unable to sleep, I blinked my eyes and noticed a message written on the bedroom door. It read, "I know you're awake." 3. I grabbed my husband's arm tightly as we walked through the haunted house. By the time we got out, he was nowhere to be found, but I was still holding his arm. 4. Would you like some milk in your coffee? Asked the old woman. As she opened the fridge, I caught a glimpse of something that looked like a human head. 5. I awoke to my grandmother gently caressing my hair. It was nice until I remembered she died when I was 9. 6. Eat your cookie, screamed the old man at the little boy. Eat your cookie or I'll kill you. The boy's puppy's name was Cookie. 7. Sometimes, when people come home, they feel a little paranoid and check every room just to make sure that they're the only ones in the house. I've seen you do this. Luckily for me, you never check behind the curtains. 8. A man was shaving in front of a mirror. When he bent over to rinse his face in the sink, his reflection didn't move. 9. They opened his grave, but all they found was the head of the poor man whose body he had stolen. 10. All night, you keep hearing a faint creaking noise. You keep looking behind you, but there's nothing there. Why don't you look above you? 11. Last night, I heard laughter coming from the basement. My house doesn't have a basement. 12. You hear a knock on the door of your hotel room and a voice shouts, "Room service." I don't remember ordering room service, you reply. "Okay, then I'm the maid," says the voice. 13. While I was away, someone broke into my home. Nothing was stolen, but they left a dusty old coffin in the middle of my living room. 14. My neighbor has been screaming at me for days now. Maybe I should have buried her head with rest of her. 15. The darkness swallowed her. Then it spit her out. 16. You are on the toilet, taking a poop. You go to wipe. When you feel something grab your wrist and start pulling your hand into the bowl. You struggle and manage to free yourself. Jumping off the toilet, you turn to look, but there is nothing there. Now your hand is covered in poop. 17. Last night, as I was sleeping alone in my room, I smelled a fart that wasn't mine. Eating at night. Excerpt. Eating at night is a scary story about a man who strikes a bargain with a ghoul in order to protect his dead wife's corpse. Many years ago, in a small town, there was a murderer on the loose. All of the townsfolk lived in fear that they would be his next victim. Over the course of 7 nights, 7 people were murdered. They were all men and they had all been out walking in the park late at night, unaware that they were in danger. Their throats were cut and their bodies were found lying in the town cemetery. Their corpses had been ripped open and their entrails were devoured in a fearsome manner. Everybody thought the murderer must be some deranged lunatic. On the 8th night, the police staked out the park and spotted a young man lurking in the bushes. When they stopped him and searched his pockets, they found a blood-stained knife. He was arrested and taken before a judge, accused of being a serial killer. The young man's name was Lester Banks. Nobody in town could believe that he could possibly be guilty of such horrible crimes. He was known to be a nice, pleasant and generous fellow who could always be relied on to help anyone who was in need. In fact, he was so well liked that a group of people stood outside the courthouse protesting his arrest. The judge was shocked by the atrociousness of the crimes and found it hard to reconcile them with the young man's polite demeanor and well-spoken manner. He decided to question the young man himself. "Lester Banks," he said, "you have been charged with horrific crimes. Do you want to do the right thing by unburdening your conscience and making a confession?" The young man stood up and faced the judge. His hands were shaking with emotion and tears were rolling down his cheeks. "Your Honor, I do," he replied. "I must admit that I am guilty. I am ashamed to say that I murdered all 7 of these poor, innocent people. It was I alone who killed them, but I am not a monster. I didn't murder them for their money or their belongings. I am not a thief." "Then, why did you kill them?" asked the judge. The young man hung his head in shame and told this story. 2 weeks ago, I had the perfect life. My mother and father raised me well and always taught me right from wrong. I was a decent, honest and God-fearing man. I had a good job, I worked hard and I took care of my family. I was married to a wonderful woman named Amina and I loved her more than anything on this earth. We were blissfully happy together and we were eagerly awaiting the birth of our first child. When my wife died in childbirth, I was overcome with grief. It was so sudden and unexpected that I was stunned beyond belief. On the day of her funeral, I stood by her graveside, crying bitter tears as I watched them lower her coffin into the earth. It was the saddest day of my life. That night, I couldn't sleep and found myself wandering aimlessly through the town. Eventually, I came to the cemetery. I wanted to go to my wife's grave and say goodbye to her one last time, but I noticed I was not alone. There was another man in the cemetery. He was crouching over my wife's grave. As I drew closer, I realized that he was digging it up. I flew into a rage and attacked the strange man. He fought back and he seemed to have superhuman strength. He easily overpowered me and with one hand, he grabbed hold of my throat and began to squeeze, lifting me into the air. There was nothing I could do to stop him and I thought he was going to strangle the life out of me. Then, without warning, he let me go. I tumbled to the ground, clutching my throat and trying desperately to catch my breath. The man stood over me and when I looked up I could see his face was hideous. He had eyes that burned with a scarlet fire and a cavernous mouth full of huge gnarled teeth. "What do you want?" he demanded in a booming voice. "That's my wife's grave," I gasped. "Why were you trying to dig her up?" "I am a ghoul," the man hissed, "an eater of the dead. I have come to feast on the fresh corpse that was buried in this grave today. Now be gone, for I have not eaten since yesternight, and I am much a-hungered." "Spare this grave, I beg you," I said. I loved my wife more than anything in this world. I couldn't stand it if her body was desecrated. "I'll do anything you wish, just leave my wife in peace." The ghoul was angered, and said, "I will do as you ask, but only on one condition. Every night, for the next 8 nights, you will bring me a fresh corpse. Do this for me and in return, I will not disturb your wife's grave." With that, the ghoul turned and walked off, disappearing into the trees. I left the graveyard that night and stumbled home, filled with anguish and sorrow. Throughout the next day I was torn between my conscience and the horrible bargain I had struck with the ghoul. After sunset, I put a knife in my pocket and made my way to the park. I hid among the bushes and waited for someone to pass by. When I saw a man walking down the path, I drew my knife, crept up behind him and slit his throat. Then, I dragged his body to the cemetery and gave him to the ghoul. Every night, for the next 6 nights, I returned to the park and repeated the same foul deed. Every night, the ghoul was waiting for me in the cemetery, and as I watched in horror and disgust, he tore the corpses open with his bare hands and devoured their insides. In all, I murdered 7 people. Just one more and my bargain with the ghoul would have been complete. I was horrified by what I did, but all of it was done in fear of the fate that would befall my wife's corpse if I broke the bargain I had made. This is my sad, shameful and disgusting story, said the young man. Unfortunately, it was all for nothing, and tonight, when I fail to provide him with another corpse, the ghoul will consume the body of my wife. The things I have done are unforgivable. I murdered innocent people. I don't expect mercy. I deserve to die for the terrible crimes I have committed. When the young man finished telling his story, the judge was amazed. He had never heard such a strange and depraved tale. He pondered for a long time and then passed judgment, saying, "Lester Banks, the crimes you have committed are indeed heinous, and you deserve to be punished harshly. I see that you are genuinely sorry for what you have done, and I believe you are an honorable man. For this reason, I am going to set you free and allow you to punish yourself. I believe you already know what you must do." "Thank you for this mercy," replied the young man. He walked out of the court as everyone present stared in amazement. The next morning, another body was found in the cemetery. It was the body of Lester Banks, and he was lying, half devoured, on the grave of his wife. He had taken his own life. In this way, he punished himself for his crimes while also keeping his terrible bargain with the ghoul. The final corpse he provided was his own. Restless Leg Syndrome. Excerpt. Restless Leg Syndrome is a spooky ghost story about an old man who has a pain in his leg that just won't go away. One night, he finally tells his grandson the chilling truth behind his ailment. "My grandfather suffered from restless leg syndrome. At least, that's what he told me for years. He rarely got a good night's sleep. His leg hurt too much and he had to keep getting up and walking around to dull the pain. My grandmother said he had the condition ever since he came back from the war. The day he returned, she was there at the train station to greet him. He limped down the platform, and fell into her welcoming arms. She said he had always refused to use a cane or a crutch, no matter how much he struggled with walking. One dark and stormy night, Granddad was limping down the hallway, on his way to bed. I was walking behind him to make sure he didn't fall over. Just then, there was a flash of lightning. That was the first time I saw it. I thought I caught a glimpse of something wrapped around his leg." "What was that?" I asked in alarm. When he got to the bedroom and turned on the light, I could see there was nothing there. "What was that on your leg?" I asked again. I thought I saw something. Just for a split second. Something strange. What was it? "I guess it's time I told you," said my grandfather as he lay down on the bed. "It's not restless leg syndrome. It happened during the war. In 1942, I was stationed in New Guinea. I saw terrible things, horrible things, the kind of things that would make you sick to your stomach. Most people who have been to war try to forget. You try to push it to the back of your mind, you try not to think about it. I have tried to forget, but it never lets me. Not even for one day. I am cursed, you see, cursed to carry it around for the rest of my life as a reminder." When we landed in New Guinea, we were all fresh-faced and inexperienced. We had no idea what lay in store for us. We set up camp on the island's southern coast, and some of the local people, Papuans, they called them, were helping us out with supplies. There was a little Papuan boy who used to hang around our camp. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. I can't even remember his name. The only words he knew in English were yes and no. I guess he was impressed by all the soldiers in uniform. He would run around trying to get all the fellows to play games with him. With the Japanese soldiers still nearby, it was very dangerous there for him, so we tried to scare him off. No matter what we did, the little fellow just kept coming back. One night, the Japanese attacked us. We were outnumbered and they damn near overran our position. I awoke to the sound of yelling and screaming outside my tent. It was chaos. Shots were being fired left and right. It was close quarters combat. I was terrified. I stumbled out of my bunk, grabbed my gun and rushed to join the fighting. In the darkness, I felt something wrap itself around my leg. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that I had to get out to my position as fast as I could. My buddies needed me. Whatever it was, it had me in its clutches. I could barely move my leg. It was almost pitch black and I was desperately trying to free myself. I swung my rifle butt down viciously in an effort to break its grip. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning and it illuminated the tent for a split second. I looked down and I saw his scared eyes looking up at me. Blood was running down his face. I had bashed his head in. Out of fear, the little Papuan boy had run into my tent and grabbed onto my leg. I saw his eyes slowly roll back into his head as he breathed his last, but he didn't let go. He never let go, he will never let go. Supermodel. Excerpt. The Supermodel is a scary story about a beautiful woman who posts pictures of herself every day on Facebook. After a while, she begins to suspect that she is being stalked by one of her fans. 2 years ago, there was a supermodel I had a huge crush on. She was really one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. One day, when I was looking at her website, I noticed that she had a Facebook account. I sent her a friend request and, the next day, she accepted. On Facebook, she had thousands of fans and whenever she posted a new picture, she would write a few lines, telling everyone what was going on in her life. Her fans would post comments too, telling her how beautiful she was or how much they adored her. The supermodel updated her Facebook with a new photo every day. Sometimes she would have a new hairstyle, sometimes she would take a photo of herself without makeup and occasionally she would dress up in a costume. Every morning, when I arrived at work, I would check her Facebook to see what new picture she had posted of herself. However, one day, when I checked her account, there was no update. I was a little disappointed. Then, I looked at the last comment she had posted. I think I have a stalker. In fact, I'm sure of it. Someone was in my room yesterday when I was out. The other day, I felt like I was being followed. Is it one of you? I'm going to contact the police tomorrow. There were a lot of comments from her fans, telling her they were worried about her and begging her to let them know she was alright. It was a little creepy, but I didn't think much more about it. Over the next week, the supermodel didn't write anything more, but her picture was updated every day. On Monday, it was a close-up of her nose, on Tuesday, her mouth, on Wednesday her ear, on Thursday her arm, on Friday, her legs and on Saturday, her feet. In the comments on each picture, her fans were becoming more and more worried. When I saw the image that was posted on Sunday, I almost threw up. It was a picture of a smiling man, holding a woman's mutilated corpse in his arms. Her head had been cut off and it was sitting on her stomach. There was some text written beneath it. Here is your precious supermodel. None of you can have her. She belongs to me now and I won't share her with anyone. Her password was too easy to guess. It was her birthday. It was absolutely horrific. As soon as I saw it, I called the police to report it, but they didn't take me seriously. I decided to go down to the police station in person. I gave them the URL of her Facebook and when they opened it I realized that the image had changed again. It was a picture of the man's severed head. The police immediately rushed to her address and when they found the supermodel's apartment, they broke down the door. Inside, they found the dead bodies of a man and a woman. Both of them had been decapitated. The police were presented with a real mystery. They knew who murdered the supermodel, but they could never figure out who killed her murderer. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Black and white photos. Excerpt. Black and White Photos is a creepy story about a group of friends who go camping and come across an old cabin in the mountains. It is based on a Japanese story. When I was in high school, I went camping in the mountains with 3 friends of mine. After we set up our tents, we set out to explore the area. After hiking for an hour, we were getting tired and the light was fading. It was almost time to turn back. Just then, we came across an old, dilapidated shack. Curious, we all decided to check it out. When I think about it now, I wish we had just left it alone and gone back to our campsite. The ramshackle hut was in a bad state of disrepair and the wood was rotting away. One of my friends tried to open the door, but it was stuck fast. We all gave it a big pull and managed to force it open. Inside, the cabin was covered in dirt and rubbish was strewn about the floor. There was a chest of drawers and beside it, there was a huge stack of dusty newspapers. It looked like nobody had lived there for a long time. While my friends were looking around the cabin, I picked up one of the newspapers. The date on the cover was 1961. I wondered who had been living in the cabin at that time. I shuffled through the newspapers until I came to the one at the bottom of the pile. There was an article on the front page that seemed familiar. I looked at the date of the newspaper and realized it had just come out a few days before. There was definitely still someone living in the cabin. I had an unpleasant feeling in the pit of my stomach. Just then, one of my friends exclaimed, "Wow! What's wrong?" I asked. "When I opened the drawer, these fell out," he said, pointing to a pile of black and white photos that were lying on a shelf. He handed around the photographs and we all flipped through them. At first I didn't know what I was looking at. There were pictures of two girls sitting on chairs. The photos seemed to have been taken in the cabin. However, when I looked closer, I noticed that both girls were bound and gagged. They had terrified expressions on their faces. "OMG!" exclaimed one of my friends. "This is too weird," I said. "Let's get out of here, fast." We left the hut immediately and started the long walk back to our campsite. It was getting dark and we kept glancing over our shoulders, making sure nobody was following us. That night, none of us could sleep a wink. We lay awake in our tent and talked about the weird black and white photos we had seen. All of us were creeped out by them. "Maybe we should report them to the police," I suggested. "Let's just forget about everything that happened today," replied my friend. The others agreed. The next morning, we packed up our stuff and drove home. My friends dropped me off outside my house. My parents were away for the weekend. I carried my bag inside and went upstairs to take a shower. When I opened the door to my bedroom, I got the shock of my life. The walls were lined with black and white photos. The same black and white photos we had found in the shack.